Morning, everybody. David Ashby here with the Smashby podcast, and today's subject is going to be a men's group that I actually have been attending for about 4 months now. And a friend of mine invited me to this group called Momentum. They meet very early in a park, and I went and I had an amazing time. And one of the people that I met there was my friend Kim, who also leads the beginning Launchpad group. And through that, we've actually established a team. And Kim is still part of it to this day. And I've grown very close to him, even though I see him about once a week. And we'll get into that further. But Kim, why don't you say hello and tell us a little bit about Momentum and Launchpad?
Hi, Ashby. Yeah, it's been a pleasure being on team with you, and I do manage the formation of new teams as new men come into the organization. We had a time when we tried to assimilate men onto existing teams, but we've had so much kind of growth in the last year that it's made more sense to form new teams, and so. It's actually really exciting to bring a bunch of new men together who are at that place in time in their life when they're ready to do this thing we call men's work.
Awesome. So can you tell me a little bit about Momentum, how it got started? I know initially it wasn't called Momentum.
That's right. That's right. And you have to go way back into the 80s to something called, well, where I'm going to pick my starting point. Let's go all the way back. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, I'm not sure the published date of this book, Iron John, Robert Bly, I believe. This is sort of this time in the 60s. Everyone is kind of exploring self-awareness, and whereas we think of summer of love and the things that were very much men and women together, there was also a certain group of men who were in that exploration going in the direction of asking questions around particularly men, their particular experience in life, what it means to have a masculine part of your character. And the thinking was very early on that we are suffering from a lack of good mentors, male mentors in life. You've got the sort of the period of the 50s we came out of, where men were off at work and women were set up at home to raise the kids, and then they had this crop of young men who were raised by mothers. And so there was a rebellion to that. And there was a rebellion, an awakening, an asking of, hey, we just did this. Does this make a lot of sense? And if you think about it right before then, or at least going back 100 years, how did a boy grow up? He grew up alongside his dad, probably working on the farm. And there was a lot of masculine mentorship for a young man. So anyway, long story short, it kind of really is the experiment, I think, of the 50s, if you think about it, that let women be sort of solely in charge of raising the kids, and that meant, of course, the boys. And there was this questioning, okay, well, does that really raise a good man? And a lot of these early thinkers thought, no, it doesn't, and we need to reestablish how men, young boys, are cultivated, and what it means to really have that character that really, in a lot of ways, we still very much sort of romantically expect out of men, but we don't have all the supports that help the men create that. So early on, there's a man named Justin Sterling who started a series of workshops over in Oakland. That was, I think it was the early workshop was called the Men's Sex and Power Workshop Weekend. I'm sorry. Sex and Power Weekend. And these were very intense weekend experiences where men were sort of this. I haven't been, but
Mm.
I've heard so many accounts of it, and it's still going on to this day. And I still hear that it's an amazing experience. But and that was an initial starting point that a lot of men kind of got exposed to this idea of men's work, and then from there, they started forming groups, teams of men that could continue the work in a small group setting after the workshop. You can imagine a workshop is a workshop, right? So they needed to kind of integrate that into life after the workshop. They set up these teams of men, maybe about 10. And because it's a early, trying to establish itself, the Sterling organization put a lot of expectation on these teams to help send new men back to future workshops. And that began to feel a little proselytizing, I think, to some of the men, and they didn't want to be controlled by this. They were taught to take initiative in their life, and they thought, well, how is letting this organization tell us what to do initiative? So they decided to break off from the Sterling organization, and about 27 years ago, there was the formation of what was then called the Nation of Men. They kept a lot of the same ideas in place, but really all these ideas are borrowed, right? So they're pulling forward archetypal ideas from Jung. They're pulling forward, sort of all the things, the tribal kind of understandings of how person to person, man to man transmission of wisdom could take place. And that's continued to grow to this day, where you now see in what's now called Momentum, renamed just 3 years ago to Momentum, you see that we continue to collect things from the outside. So the magic of Momentum isn't a certain set of practices or ideas that came from any of the things I just mentioned, but it's more, we'll probably get to this, what does make momentum today. In a nutshell, it is the man-to-man transmission, the things that can happen in this setting that men can transmit to each other and support each other.
Mm. That's wonderful. So how long have you been with Momentum?
Ninth year.
Ninth year?
Ninth year, yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it had been a lot longer with the way that you're so connected to that group.
Well, we'll say that, probably many of your listeners have had this experience where you, especially in today's world, where kind of so many long tail type things exist, but you think this must exist. It's just an intuition, and you go out on the internet and you just go looking for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had very much that experience where I was like having a rocky period in my marriage, and I thought, I've just moved to the Bay Area a couple of years ago. There has to be men's group that would be a perfect fit for me, and went looking, and there it was.
Nice. Where did you found it on Meetups, I'm assuming, or?
No, we weren't on Meetup at the time. I guess it was just a basic search.
Oh, wow. Okay. Just found it on Google. Well, yeah, it's the Bay Area. You can throw a stone and find something. Yeah.
That's right. And I guess what I'm trying to say is it feels very integrated to other things that I've done. I've been practicing Zen for 33 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just explaining actually to my teacher, who's like 84 years old, a week ago, like what we do in Momentum. And he was like, yeah, of course, that's definitely, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought of that one, but that's perfect. And so it's consistent. Zen also has a very rich oral transmission tradition.
Gotcha. What are the values of momentum? I know at all the general meetings, most of the general meetings, they read them off, but this is kind of a test to see after 9 years if you can remember.
Yeah. Um, you know, there are a list of standards, we call them. Um, and, that the list of standards that we have, it's kind of nice, honor women and, do what you say you're going to do what you said you're going to do, and things like that. I will say, actually, I think of the rather than a list, I think the best way to think of momentum is that we are really engaged in an alternative social contract. In the world we live in, clearly we compete, we promote ourselves, we get our LinkedIn page looking good, we polish the message of who we are, and it's going to be nothing but you know peaches and cream if you associate with me, right? So we have all of these ways in which we promote ourselves. uh, Momentum reverses that social contract in prioritizing a vulnerability to men you trust. It's an important difference
Hmm.
over a self-promotional uh, uh, posture. So that the competitive environment where we promote ourselves is appropriate for especially an increasingly anonymous world where you don't know who you're dealing with, and you're selling yourself, and that's probably completely appropriate. But what's different in the world now is that we have lost a lot of our small tribe, and that small tribe is something that those are people or men that you trust. And so, but then when we get into a situation where we could be in a trusting stance, it doesn't occur to us because we haven't really actually, other than our family, I guess, and even even families seem to keep a lot of secrets from each other. So what momentum does is says, we're going to switch this contract and reverse it so that we're going to create a safe place where the men have agreed to a set of values that will allow you to trust. Such one of the things is the first thing out of the box is you have to keep what you hear from another man in confidence. You can't
Hmm.
get
Hmm.
confidentiality. It's like number one, to make that space safe. And then the expectation reverses. So it's like, if you show up in a self-promotional mode, it's like, oh, no, 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 no. We want to see you. So it's a vulnerability to each other so that we can be visible to each other.
Mm.
Therein is the sort of magic nexus of what makes momentum very special. You've agreed to go into a trusting relationship where you can be seen. And the difference between being seen and not being seen is the difference between loneliness and connectedness, right? Connecting is about being seen. So
Yeah.
we make it safe to be seen. That's, to me, the core of what momentum is about.
Hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that I picked up on when I first started going was the vulnerability, is that is valued in momentum. And in our world nowadays, it has such a negative connotation. Oh, he's so vulnerable, I don't want to be around him because he's so vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And in momentum, it's the opposite. It's he's being vulnerable and people rush in to encourage or to make sure he feels safe, make sure he feels heard.
Yeah, it goes. That's certainly true. Although we do see that, like, if a politician gets up and they're playing their cards very close to the vest, we see that right away, and
Mm-hmm.
then we don't trust them. So we know that if we want to trust somebody, being able to see them is a key ingredient, and that's one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that politicians have to do to kind of play that game, to figure out how to at least appear to be that. So I think that's all. Obviously, that's baked in our DNA, that we know
Mm-hmm.
that that's something that means I can trust somebody. But yeah, you bring up a great point that so taking it to the next step, it's an alternative social contract. Well, we've flipped it. We've prioritize vulnerability over self-promotion. And then who you're vulnerable to, you're vulnerable to the other men and not to any like guru or central teacher.
Mm-hmm.
This is really important because in that piece, you're not expected to sign up for anybody's agenda or dogma, but rather you're trusting a collective of the tribe, if you will. And so as that becomes apparent, the efficacy of that becomes apparent, the men on the team, okay, that let's say you've got 10 men, they're getting together once a week for 2 hours, they're seeing each other open, they're seeing how powerful that is, how that's what you really want from the other men. And so the reward system flips with so it's not that we flipped something and then we just get to go. It's not just that it just works by accident. It works because I believe, this, when you start going back into biological, how we inherited our biology from 100,000 years ago. It's hard to prove any of this, but my sense of it is that it's in our DNA to know the efficacy of that trusting process, that we create something you can't have otherwise. Like if I'm going to be on the hunt with my tribe, the men of my tribe, I would not know who I could trust and who I couldn't unless I could really see them. So you see the efficacy of it, and then the expectation for that lifts up. And so it's amazing to me. At first, men are all kind of like, "Oh, I don't know how to be. I'm going to do this or not." Well, they teach each other, and as a leader, it's a fascinating process to really kind of be invisible once you set the match, and then the men reward each other for that vulnerability, and so it's I think it's in our DNA. I don't think it needs anybody. This isn't some new thing that's being dropped onto lighten us. It's coming from someplace very deep.
So you touch bases very quickly on having a guru and having a teacher versus the structure of momentum, which is interesting in and of itself. And the structure of momentum is, as far as I can see, it's a flat plane. Every man is equal. There's no hierarchy. There's no structure. There's organization, but it's not one man taking precedent over everybody else.
Yeah. And yet there are definitely leaders who are obviously much more influential than someone else who's not doing much leading, but you earn all of it in real time. So you say, oh my God, this is something I really care about, this initiative I'm going to take. You don't ask anybody really permission for the most part. You just take up the initiative, and very quickly, again, because you're visible, men can read you. And it is, like, hey, that initiative makes sense to me. I'm behind you. And you find yourself powerfully influential, but it's not power that was handed down hierarchically.
Nice. Yeah. So in momentum, there is a chief, and his responsibility is more organizing the events, correct?
Well, I do think that the chief definitely, we do say the chief has a vision that but what we're about ready to do, what we call our primal night in January, which happens every other year or so. There's no schedule. It's called when a chief is ready to step down. And so now other men who want to be chief and feel as if they have a vision will step forth and really make their pitch to the community of men at what their vision is and why they think they should be chief. And, literally, because men tend to like things in a very physical level. So this is outdoors at night around a fire. They'll literally stand behind the other man and put a hand on the back of his shoulder and say, yeah, I stand with you. And in fact, one of the things I care about tremendously is the new men coming in. That's what I've dedicated the last several years of my time in momentum to. I've already started having conversations with chiefs that are, asking to be considered.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be like, well, tell me what you're going to do for new men. So it's like a political process, but it's the difference again is that visibility. We got
Mm.
such a high priority on being visible and being we have we have a bunch of terms in momentum that we've sort of coined. One of them is trust the men. What that means is that, here's a great example, is that I'm trusting you to be open, and that also means that I give you sort of unfiltered data on me, where as opposed to packages of spun data, right?
Mm-hmm.
So by doing that, you have a lot more ability to really determine, who should lead.
Nice, nice. I lost my track in the questions. What do people often get out of momentum? I think we've kind of touched bases on that here and there, but
Oh, it's sort of, yeah. How do I want to start with that? I think I'm going to segue just slightly
mm-hmm.
to this moment when men tend to come into the organization, because that's when they are seeking to get this thing out
Yeah,
of it, right? And I think it tells you a lot. So I like to say, you know, this is changing over time, but I started saying when I first was early in the organization that probably for sure nationwide, there's only like 1 in 100 men, I think, who kind of have the inclination to work on themselves in this early time, in this early phase of this sort of social experiment that we're doing. Everyone can't be an iconoclast, right? So I think maybe it's down to 1 in 50. I don't know, because times are changing pretty quickly right now.
mm-hmm.
But it's a fairly rare thing that you want to be a part of a sort of a forward social movement. So then, even with that in mind, to do the sort of intensity of the work that we do, you really have to be motivated. And usually it's in a time of a man's life when there's some crisis or difficulty where that man can really see the value proposition even more clearly.
Mm.
So I'd say that it's only of the men who are in that 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 that I just mentioned, it's only 10% time there's only like the 10% hardest times of their lives is when they are really like, hey, whatever it takes, I know I need connection. I know I need community. My marriage is falling apart, whatever it is. And they're highly motivated. So I think that that's what's initially bringing men in, is when they just sort of, they've hit a bottom of some kind, or a dismantling of the things that they were investing in. And, probably they were investing a lot in their own self-promotion. They thought that would be enough for them. And it's in those times that they really get motivated to come in. And so I think that's what they do get out. Now, you know, after spending some time in the organization, I think, yeah, it's night and day. I think that the staying power is amazing. It's like these men are dedicating 100 hours a year to
Mm-hmm.
just the team meetings, and then there's the monthly meetings, and then there's the weekend, and this is probably getting up to like 200 hours a year. It's a big investment, right? And the staying power is really impressive to me. There's men that've been in the organization for all 27 years.
Mm-hmm.
So and plenty of men like me have been 10 plus. So those men are getting something they absolutely don't see it anywhere else. This just doesn't it doesn't exist. They don't have another place where a critical mass of men are there supporting them to be open and rewarding, kind of the real you, because when you're vulnerable, you're exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you walk away, you go, oh, wow, I got validated for being actually me, as opposed to some clever thing I came up with. So I think that's the main thing that men are getting out of it, is this validation for their true self.
Amazing. Um, And I've definitely gotten that out of momentum early on. I'm used to when I'm vulnerable, it kind of gets, I've had people use that vulnerability against me. Whereas in momentum, like you said, the validation really comes into play, and walking away and knowing that no man is going to use what he's learned about you against you
Mm-hmm.
is gratifying, and it helps you be vulnerable in other aspects of your life.
Yeah, it sure does. You see the efficacy of it.
Yeah. We're this is personal question, but how well, not personal question, I should say. Uh, how big is momentum? Is it 12 guys? Teams are smaller. General meetings generally be how large?
Yeah, so we have about 185 full members. That's a record.
Mm-hmm.
We're bigger than we've ever been. We've always been a little bit grassroots in our orientation. There were other groups that split off of Sterling back 20 some years ago. There's one called the Mankind Project, which split off a little bit after us, and we actually helped them a little bit in their formation, and they became actually bigger,
Mm-hmm.
um, like the international. So I think there's several thousand men involved with that one. We've stayed a little more grassroots, which, I mean, if you live in the Bay Area, I think momentum's kind of like pretty special sweet spot of size and originality and its own thing.
Mm. Nice. So you would say that the general meetings tend to be about 80 people.
Yeah, we've just I think this last general meeting we hit 83 men in a park, like you said, at
Uh-huh.
45 on a Saturday morning. And it's part of the visceral part of this whole thing is it's like, yeah, we're gonna get out there at the first break of dawn in a park, 83 men, and what are we doing? We'll probably get to that, but yeah, we got into a record size on our general meetings, but these teams that we're talking about are more like in the range of 7 to 10 men. So there's this very combined experience of the larger organization, which you can see anywhere from 60 to 80 men once a month uh, at that meeting, and then weekly you're in this smaller environment.
Mm. Yeah. I I've heard it said that the team meetings are where a lot of growth happens, but that's just in my personal experience. It's because that's where you're meeting more often and you're having more time to unravel yourself and reveal yourself to all these your tribe.
Yeah, it's definitely the combination. The cross pollination between the smaller teams and the large organization is pretty stunningly. It's 1 plus 1 is 3. It really is, because you'll be in their team meeting, and there is the advantage of the intimacy, but then there's also something that crops up, especially over time. Year in, year out. I The saying goes that men can get a little complacent, and they can you can kind of get a little like, if you got something that you're really protecting and you're not showing it, eventually the other men will sort of make could. I mean, I'm not saying this always happens, but it can start to happen that we say, you agree to buy my bullshit and I'll buy yours. And so that can happen. There can be a kind of a staleness in teams. So the cross pollination, what it does is that, all those same values, and then you're exposed to other men who aren't on team with you. And we do work on our Saturday morning in the park. So, you might be, trying to tell that same story that everybody else has bought into on your team to now some other men who don't know you as well, but they know the values, and they're like, I'm not sure I'm buying that. It's pretty powerful to have that kind of opportunity. And then you haven't also seen is the weekend that we
Mm-hmm.
do. We do a weekend once a year in the woods, and it's like that much deeper.
Nice. Yeah, one of the values, I don't know if it's of momentum, I definitely know it's of our team, is brutal compassion. And I've had several people who I've told about momentum say, what is brutal compassion? I say, well, that's the freedom to look at another man and say bullshit, and call them out on something and say, uh, this isn't, you're not being totally authentic with us right now.
Yeah, ruthless
Ruthless
compassion
compassion.
is actually
Yeah.
how it's in our dictionary. We've we actually worked on augmenting our dictionary this year, or formalizing it.
Mm.
And I was just looking at it the other day, and it's over 200 terms. And we've deleted a bunch that we thought were marginal terms. So I mean, we have 200 terms that we've used. Ruthless compassion is something we've coined, and we actually had a really good discussion on that recently. And this is an interesting outcome. Ruthless compassion is calling out another man. Sure,
Mm.
it's dangerous because your ego can start to get in there and just, like, hey man, I know you're pulling the wool over my eyes, and I'm going to call you out on it. But I think my favorite way of looking at ruthless compassion is that if you're going to quote call another man out on something, you do it in a way that you yourself become very vulnerable, because you're confessing what you really think inside.
Mm.
And you're not pretending like, yeah, I love you too, and I'm going to be real, I want to be your friend, I hope you like me. You're taking a risk not to be liked.
Mm-hmm.
And if you hold that with the responsibility that it is, and the vulnerability you yourself are taking, and you do it in a way that you yourself are vulnerable, that's it's a lot more effective. And yeah, so it's like, we talk about in it's the term reverse check-ins,
Mm-hmm.
that it really is that. It is reversing the vulnerability to the person sharing what came up when they heard the original thing you shared.
Gotcha. For my last question, it's just, where can people find information on momentum? Where can they go? What can they do?
Yeah, so that's real simple. GoMomentum.org is the website. And
Mm-hmm.
if you, uh, look up what events you can come to, that Saturday meeting once a month is listed. And then there's also the opportunity to, if that sounds too big to you,
Mm-hmm.
we do also have a way of letting men just come directly on to visit a team. Teams are autonomous, so for a man to join a team, that's really up to the team. Again, it's this thing. We're rewarding each other for the vulnerability. If a man showed up on a team, for example, and wasn't willing to be vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
probably wouldn't be a fit. They probably wouldn't end up on that team. And so that is part of that whole ecosystem that rewards what we're talking about. So you can get on it. You can go visit a team at least one time. Um, yeah, yeah. And if you live in Albuquerque, we don't have momentum there just yet. But there is one team that is virtual.
Okay.
But what we're finding is that you actually have to have the eye-to-eye contact. These men had that for years and years and years, and then went virtual.
Mm-hmm.
To try to start a new team without the face-to-face probably doesn't work. So we're kind of growing slowly, but it's the Bay Area right now.
Nice, nice. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us. If people wanted to find momentum, it's momentum.org. It's also on meetups, correct?
It's gomomentum.org,
Go.
because we didn't get somebody else. I think I don't know, it's like Christian fundamentalist group or something has that URL. But yeah, gomomentum.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kim, for sitting down with me and telling me about the organization. If there's anybody out there that wants to get involved, I highly encourage it. You'll grow in ways you didn't imagine you could.
My pleasure.
with that, we're signing off of the Smashby podcast.